In the autumn of 1942, the world was balanced on a knife's edge. The Second World War had been raging for 3 years, and though the Allies had found some victories, the Axis powers still seemed formidable, even unstoppable in certain parts of the globe. Nazi Germany controlled almost all of continental Europe, from the storm-battered coasts of France to the gates of Stalingrad in the Soviet Union. Italy, under Mussolini, still held sway over much of the Mediterranean. In North Africa, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and his Afrika Korps were pressing eastward, threatening Egypt and the Suez Canal, a lifeline of the British Empire. For Britain, exhausted by years of war, and for America, only recently thrust into the global conflict after Pearl Harbor, the question loomed: how could they strike back effectively? The answer, though debated and contested within the Allied High Command, eventually settled on North Africa. This was not a decision made lightly, nor without tension. American leaders, particularly General George C. Marshall, had argued strongly for a direct invasion of Europe through France. They believed the quickest path to defeating Hitler was to hit Germany head-on, to strike at the heart of Nazi-occupied territory. But the British, led by Winston Churchill, knew that such an invasion in 1942 would be reckless. The Allies simply weren't ready. They lacked the ships, the landing craft, the planes, and the seasoned troops necessary to storm the heavily fortified coast of northern France. Churchill remembered vividly the disasters of earlier raids like Dieppe, where Allied soldiers had been slaughtered attempting to land against German defenses. He argued instead for what he called the soft underbelly of Europe. That underbelly in 1942 was North Africa. By striking there, the Allies could secure the Mediterranean, protect vital shipping lanes, and prepare the stage for later campaigns in Italy and eventually France. More importantly, it would be the first real test of American ground forces against German and Italian troops. Roosevelt, eager to bring U.S. forces into direct battle with Hitler's armies, agreed. The plan was codenamed Operation Torch. Torch was bold, ambitious, and risky. It would be the largest amphibious operation in history up to that time, a complex dance involving hundreds of ships, thousands of planes, and over 100,000 soldiers. The landings would stretch across thousands of miles of ocean and coastline, from Casablanca in Morocco to Oran and Algiers in Algeria. This wasn't just a military gamble, it was also a political one. For while the Allies would be landing in North Africa, those territories were not held directly by the Germans but by Vichy France, the collaborationist regime that had surrendered to Hitler in 1940. The French army stationed in North Africa might resist, fighting against the Allies to defend their territory. Or perhaps they might join the Allied cause. No one knew for certain. Behind the scenes, delicate negotiations unfolded. American diplomats tried to reach out secretly to French officials, gauging their willingness to switch sides. Some French officers were sympathetic, others fiercely loyal to Vichy. The situation was complicated, uncertain, and fraught with risk. Eisenhower, who had been chosen to command Operation Torch, knew this well. At just 51 years old, he had risen quickly in the U.S. Army, known for his calm demeanor, organizational brilliance, and ability to work with allies. Torch would be his first great test. Planning the operation stretched through the summer and autumn of 1942. Allied intelligence scouted beaches, tides, and harbor defenses. Naval convoys were organized in secrecy, some departing from Britain, others from the United States itself, crossing the Atlantic in great arcs to avoid German U-boats. Troops drilled for landings, though few had ever experienced combat before. Among the ranks were young Americans fresh from farms and factories, British soldiers hardened by years of war, and free French units eager to reclaim their homeland's honor. All the while, Rommel and the Afrika Korps were battling the British Eighth Army in the deserts of Egypt and Libya. At El Alamein, just weeks before the Torch landings, General Bernard Montgomery's forces struck Rommel hard, halting the Axis advance and pushing them westward. The stage was set. From the east, Montgomery would drive across Libya, while from the west, Eisenhower's Torch forces would land in Morocco and Algeria. The Axis would be caught in a pincer, squeezed between two converging armies. If the plan succeeded, North Africa could be liberated, and the Allies would have their first great victory on land against Hitler's forces. Yet success was far from guaranteed. The logistical challenges were immense. The distances were enormous. The political uncertainty of French resistance loomed like a shadow over every plan. And the Germans, though stretched thin, were formidable opponents. As the convoys assembled in the final days of October 1942, men aboard the ships whispered and wondered where they were headed. Many of the American soldiers thought they were going to Europe proper, perhaps even France. Only when the ships were far at sea did they learn their true destination, the shores of North Africa. For many it would be their baptism of fire. For the Allies, it would be a gamble that might change the course of the war. On the night of November 7, 1942, the seas off the coast of North Africa were alive with movement. The darkness was broken only by the faint glow of moonlight on waves and the dim silhouettes of ships spread across the waters. Hundreds of vessels, great and small, crept toward their designated points. The air was tense, heavy with anticipation. On the decks, soldiers huddled together, their rifles slung over their shoulders, their faces pale and anxious. They whispered in low voices, smoked nervously, or clutched rosaries and letters from home. The moment of truth was coming. The convoys had crossed thousands of miles, dodging German submarines and storms. They had come in 3 massive groups, each destined for a different target. In the west, near Casablanca, was the Western Task Force, composed largely of Americans under General George Patton, the fiery and uncompromising commander who relished the idea of battle. In the center, near Oran, the Center Task Force prepared to strike, while to the east, near Algiers, the Eastern Task Force moved silently toward its beaches. Together they represented an enormous force, over 100,000 troops backed by warships, carriers and bombers. It was the largest amphibious operation in history up to that date. Yet the question still hung over them like a cloud. Would the French resist? The French garrisons in Morocco and Algeria were still technically loyal to the Vichy government, which collaborated with Hitler. They had tanks, artillery and warships in harbor. They might fight fiercely to defend their territory, or they might surrender and join the Allies. No one knew which way they would turn until the first shots were fired. Eisenhower and his planners had hoped for the best, even sending envoys to persuade local French commanders to switch sides. But persuasion was no guarantee in the chaos of war. As dawn broke on November 8, 1942, the landings began. At Casablanca, Patton's forces surged toward the beaches. The sea was rough, the wind biting, and landing craft pitched violently as they made their way to shore. Young American soldiers, many of whom had never seen combat before, leapt into the surf with their rifles held high. The beaches erupted with the crack of gunfire. French coastal batteries opened fire, and shells whistled overhead. In the harbor, French ships scrambled to sortie, and a naval clash erupted. American warships and aircraft pounded the defenses, while landing forces struggled to gain a foothold. Chaos reigned, but slowly, steadily, Patton's men pressed forward. At Oran, the landings met similar resistance. The beaches there were narrow and heavily defended. French troops, determined not to surrender without orders, fired back with artillery and machine guns. In one particularly desperate attempt, American forces tried to seize the harbor directly by sending ships packed with soldiers through the boom defenses. But the plan turned into a disaster. The French defenders opened fire, sinking the American ships in the water. Men leapt into the flames and oil, swimming desperately for shore. It was a bloody introduction to war. Meanwhile, at Algiers, the landings unfolded differently. There, negotiations and local support from sympathetic French officers helped ease the way. Resistance was lighter, and by the end of the first day, Allied troops had secured key positions. Still, fighting flared in pockets as French units loyal to Vichy resisted stubbornly. Overhead, Allied aircraft strafed and bombed, silencing strong points and knocking out armored vehicles. The Mediterranean echoed with the thunder of naval guns as destroyers and cruisers shelled the coast to cover the advancing troops. For the men on the ground, the landings were a baptism of fire. The beaches were a terrifying mix of confusion, smoke and noise. Landing craft grounded on sandbars or tipped in the surf, spilling men into the water. Soldiers waded ashore under fire, stumbling, falling, dragging their heavy packs. Some never rose again. Others pushed forward, clawing their way up dunes and cliffs to assault enemy positions. Friend and foe alike were unsure in many places whether they were truly enemies at all. French officers argued, soldiers hesitated, but when bullets flew, hesitation turned to combat. In those hours, chaos ruled. For Eisenhower, directing the vast operation from his headquarters, reports came in piecemeal and confused. Some beaches were secured, others contested. French warships had clashed with American battleships, but U.S. naval power was overwhelming. Slowly, across Morocco and Algeria, the Allies gained the upper hand. By November 10, Casablanca had fallen, Oran was in Allied hands and Algiers was secure. The gamble had worked. The French forces, after initial resistance, agreed to cease fire. Many officers, realizing that their true enemy was Germany, chose to join the Allies. Operation Torch had succeeded. Yet the victory was not without cost. Hundreds of soldiers lay dead on the beaches, their bodies washed by the tide. Ships smoldered in harbors, landing craft sank in the shallows. For the Americans, it had been a harsh introduction to modern warfare. For the French, it was a moment of bitter choice: loyalty to a collaborationist regime or unity with the Allies. In the end, most chose unity, and their forces would soon fight side by side with the Americans and British. What Torch had done, above all, was establish a bridgehead in North Africa. The Allies now had a foothold. From there they could strike eastward, linking with Montgomery's 8th Army pushing west after El Alamein. The trap was closing on Rommel and the Afrika Korps. For Hitler, Torch was a bitter blow, proof that the Allies could coordinate massive amphibious operations and strike deep into his territory. For Roosevelt and Churchill, it was vindication, a sign that their gamble had paid off. But the story of Torch was not finished. The landings were only the beginning. Ahead lay months of hard fighting across deserts and mountains, battles against Rommel's seasoned troops, and the long campaign that would ultimately end in Tunisia. For the young Americans who had stumbled ashore at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers, Torch was the moment they became veterans. For the Allies, it was the first step on a long road that would eventually lead to Sicily, Italy, and 2 years later the beaches of Normandy. When the guns finally fell silent along the beaches and harbors of North Africa in mid-November 1942, a strange calm descended on the land. The echoes of naval bombardments still lingered in the air, and the ground bore the scars of battle: burnt-out tanks, smoking wrecks of ships, craters from artillery shells. Yet amid this destruction, a new reality began to take shape. Operation Torch had succeeded. The Allies now stood firmly on African soil, with ports and airfields under their control, and a vast new front opened against the Axis. For Eisenhower, the relief was immense. Torch had been a gamble of historic proportions, one that could easily have ended in disaster. The logistical difficulties alone had been staggering: moving fleets across the Atlantic, coordinating landings across thousands of miles, and ensuring secrecy despite the scale of the operation. On top of this, the political gamble with Vichy France had been perhaps the greatest risk. But the gamble had paid off. The French, after their initial resistance, had agreed to an armistice. Many now openly declared for the Allied cause. French officers who once wore the insignia of Vichy began to don Allied uniforms, their soldiers preparing to march under a new banner. Yet the aftermath was far from simple. The sudden switch of loyalties created confusion and suspicion. Some Americans and British troops viewed their new French allies with unease, remembering the men who had only days before been shooting at them. Some French soldiers, too, felt bitterness and humiliation at being forced into such a position. Yet slowly trust began to grow. They were united now by a common enemy, Hitler and his armies. For the American troops, the landings had been a brutal awakening. Many had gone ashore expecting an easy victory, perhaps even hoping the French would welcome them as liberators. Instead, they had found themselves under fire, stumbling across beaches littered with barbed wire and mines, losing friends to artillery and machine gun fire. They had fought their first battles, seen comrades die, and discovered the chaos and confusion that no training could ever fully prepare them for. Torch was their initiation into the grim reality of modern war. The French losses had been real too. At Casablanca and Oran, their ships had fought bravely against overwhelming odds. French sailors had died on their decks, their vessels sunk or crippled by American guns and bombs. For them, it was a tragedy, a senseless clash between men who should have been allies from the start. But war rarely allowed clean choices. In the weeks that followed, French survivors joined the Allied cause, their grief tempered by the knowledge that now, at last, they were fighting the true enemy. Politically, Torch sent shockwaves through the world. Hitler, furious at the Allied landings, ordered German troops to occupy the rest of unoccupied France, which until then had remained under nominal Vichy control. The last scraps of French independence vanished under German boots. At the same time, Axis reinforcements were rushed to Tunisia, the last stronghold in North Africa still under Axis control. The Germans and Italians were determined to hold the line there, and Rommel's forces, battered after El Alamein, fell back to regroup. Torch was not the end of the North African campaign, it was the beginning of its fiercest phase. For the Allies, however, the psychological impact was enormous. At last, American and British soldiers had carried out a massive combined operation and won. It was a proof of concept, a demonstration that the Allies could coordinate fleets, armies and air forces in a single unified strike. It showed Roosevelt's America and Churchill's Britain could fight shoulder to shoulder. And it reassured Stalin, watching grimly from Moscow, that his allies in the West were finally striking at Hitler in Europe's backyard. In the months after Torch, the Allied armies pushed eastward. Across the deserts of Algeria and into Tunisia, they advanced, sometimes stumbling, sometimes learning painful lessons at the hands of Rommel's seasoned Afrika Corps. Battles like Kasserine Pass in early 1943 would remind the Americans how much they still had to learn. But Torch had given them a foothold. With that foothold came the chance to improve, to adapt, and to grow into the army that would one day storm the beaches of Normandy. For the people of North Africa, the aftermath of Torch was a mixture of hope and hardship. Cities like Algiers and Casablanca became bustling Allied bases, filled with soldiers, supply depots, and military traffic. Ports once quiet now throbbed with the constant arrival of convoys. For civilians, life was often disrupted. Homes taken over, shortages worsened, and war always close by. Yet many also felt a sense of relief. The Allies, whatever burdens they brought, represented a chance at liberation, a break from the shadow of Vichy and Axis control. As winter settled over the Mediterranean, the beaches where young soldiers had stormed ashore became quiet again. Graves dotted the sands, marked by simple wooden crosses. For those who had fallen in the opening moments of Torch, the war was over. For their comrades, it was only just beginning. Letters home tried to explain what it had been like, but words often failed. The noise, the terror, the confusion, it was something only those who had been there could truly understand. In London and Washington, leaders studied the lessons of Torch. They saw the weaknesses, the mistakes, the missteps, but also the triumphs. Amphibious warfare had proven possible on a grand scale. Coordination between nations had held. Troops had shown courage under fire. These lessons would be refined, tested again in Sicily and Italy, and perfected by 1944 when the Allies launched the greatest invasion of all, D-Day in Normandy. In that sense, Torch was not just a victory of its own, it was a rehearsal for the liberation of Europe. As 1942 drew to a close, the tide of the war seemed at last to be turning. In Russia, the Germans were trapped in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. In North Africa, the Allies now advanced from both east and west, squeezing the Axis in a deadly vice. Across the Atlantic, America had fully entered the war, its factories roaring, its troops learning, its fleets growing stronger by the day. Torch had been the spark, the first great blaze of Allied power unleashed upon Hitler's empire. Looking back, Operation Torch was more than just a military campaign. It was a statement of intent. It told the world that the Allies were coming, that they could strike anywhere, that they would not rest until Hitler's empire was broken. It marked the moment when American and British arms, joined by French allies, began their long march back into Europe. It was the first step in a journey that would carry them from the sands of Africa to the hills of Italy, the beaches of Normandy, and ultimately into the heart of Germany itself. For the men who waited ashore on those November mornings in 1942, Torch was the beginning of everything. It was their first glimpse of war in all its confusion and courage, its fear and determination. They could not know, as they stumbled through the surf under fire, how history would remember them. But history does remember, because Torch lit the way forward, a flame carried across continents until the world was free again.